Good morning, Detroit Church. Happy Super Bowl Sunday. Is that a thing people say? So, we had a great day at the daddy-daughter disco yesterday. For those of you who went, it was a great time and a great opportunity to show our daughters that we love them. And I also want to give a special thank you to everyone who came in and served and helped set up and organize that event to give fathers like me an opportunity to spend time with my daughter in a special way. So also want to welcome Alec and Grace Krause. They're in from the Kalamazoo Church. They're sitting in the middle there. So Alec was on the church planting there, and Grace came after, and now they're married and together, and they're in town to get some encouragement and fellowship with the Detroit Church. So make sure you give them a good Detroit welcome. And I know that a lot of us are going to be distracted today. It's the Super Bowl, and some of you are probably wondering, if you have everything that you need for your recipe, and are you going to have to go to the store on Super Bowl Sunday? Some of you are wondering if it's going to be worth it to stay up late and watch the all the commercials and the halftime show. Are those going to be worth your time? And I know at least a couple of you, a couple in mind, are probably going to miss everything I say today. You're going to be in fervent prayer for your team this morning, and maybe there's one of you who will tell your neighbor that after you wake up after the sermon. So, but hopefully with this catchy title here, it'll grab your attention. We're in week 2 of our series, Narcissist. So this series, Mark last week, he did a great job. I was convicted, enjoyed the message where he talked about how we all have an inner narcissist that will show itself if we aren't legitimately dealing with our hurt and our pain. And one point that was convicting for me is I thought, as he said, that we all have this little baby inside of us that wants to get our way. And I felt that. I could think of examples from that week where that was me. And then after the service, I was talking to my wife, and she was telling me about a conversation that she was having with my dad after the service. And she said, talking to him, she said, the message was great. Normally we talk about, love or relationships or something like that in February because it's Valentine's Day. And then my dad said, well, the service is about, the series is about love. And she said, how so? He said, well, narcissists love themselves. And so that's my dad. So, studies show actually that up to 5% of the population could be clinically diagnosed as a narcissist. And so, that's interesting. And so that means that most of us here are, hopefully not narcissists, but that we all, same studies also show that everyone typically shows narcissistic traits at some point in their life. And so, what I want to talk about today is how we can slip into that sense of narcissistic entitlement and selfish pride if we don't stay focused on the right things. None of us set out to become someone like that. We don't wake up in the morning and think, I want to be entitled today. But the fact is that it can happen very fast. Yeah. And it can happen even to someone whose life and character is defined by their closeness to God, as we'll see today as we look at the scriptures. If we take our focus off of God and off of the battle, we can make prideful, entitled decisions that can alter our lives and have negative impact for generations. But the alternative is also true. That's good for us. If we stay focused on God and the battles that He puts before us, we can become more humble, we can remain close to Him, and we can inspire generations to come. Now, what's this battle that I keep talking about? A lot of you are aware that there are these spiritual forces in the world that try to keep us as far away from God and His people and the work of the kingdom as possible. We know that. And today when I use this term battle, I'm using a metaphor. There's metaphors, other metaphors that could be used, but I'm talking about the battle that it is to do the work of God, the work that He puts in our lives. The battle that it is to spread the gospel to a world that so desperately needs it. The battle that it is to love and forgive our fellow man, even when they continue to hurt us. The battle that it is to wake up and serve in the morning, to serve in Detroit Kids or serve in one of our service days. The battle to answer the call for leadership, mentoring for our youth. and to be servants in the kingdom in any way. You know, the battle to live lives that provoke our neighbors and our coworkers to ask us what it is that makes us different. You know, this morning, I want to talk about the battle that God has called you to. You know, I hope that you're inspired to humbly engage in this battle. You know, and if you're like me, that will be convicted by the entitlement and selfish pride that I see that so easily comes up in my heart. You know, I want to remind everyone why it's so important to stay focused on that battle. Because God has called you to battles that He has, for you specifically, to fight. You know, we're going to be looking at a passage in 2 Samuel today. I was speaking with Greg Johnson a couple months back about this series, Narcissist, wondering what direction to go in this, and he kind of pointed me in the direction of the example of King David. David's life was full of battles and wars. You know, and we'll pick up in 2 Samuel 11, but I'm going to describe a situation in the chapter beforehand where there's this brief lull in the fighting of David's life. You know, he sent his condolences to the king, the new king of the Ammonites, whose father had just passed away, and they had good relations, so he sent an envoy. Now, the Ammonites, they thought this was a ploy, so they told their new king to disrespect Israel's envoys and send them away. Now, I think that's not a smart move for to do to a country that's proved itself in battle so many times, like King David's Israel. But that was their decision, and so David, characteristic of himself, he and his army went and fought the Ammonites and their allies, defeated them, and had them running back to their capital city. Then the winter sets in, and then this is what happens next. We pick up 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. In the spring, at the time when the kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. You know, David, he sent Joab to finish the job, and they defeated the Ammonites all the way to their capital city and besieged it. And David, here he does something very uncharacteristic of himself. You know, we'll talk about why I think this is, why he did this, and we'll also talk about what happens with him. You know, if you've spent much time around church of any kind or watching church, Bible shows and things like that, you've probably heard of David. You know, he started at a young age, killing beasts that attacked his flock, right? And then before he even was done with puberty, he already killed Goliath. You know, he fought and he won numerous battles under King Saul. And then when Saul was getting nervous of David's victories and accomplishments, now he's on the run from Saul. He's still fighting battles, making a name for himself, making a name for God, drawing people to him. You know, the fighting barely ever stopped for a moment in his life. But now he's king. You know, and there's still lots of battles to fight. You know, he had nothing to prove. Not to any man, at least. You know, what are they going to say to him? You know, some thoughts started to slip in the head that winter, I think. You know, and I believe that we too can become susceptible to this way of thinking if we do not stay engaged in the spiritual battle. Because the battle keeps us humble. You know, when we're engaged in the battle, we're too concerned with the task at hand to be thinking about ourselves. You know, in the battle, we know that we need God's strength because we can't do it on our own. Life isn't so easy that we get lulled into this belief that we can handle things, that we don't need Him. In the battle, we're focused on keeping our brothers and sisters in the fight by our side because we know we need them. But in the natural ebbs and flows of life, maybe after a whole winter off, maybe a pandemic off, we can start to enjoy the time away from the front lines. You know, we might think to ourselves, now I deserve a little time to be selfish, right? You know, we fought hard. You know, how does somebody get to that point, though? What does someone say to themselves? What do I say to myself to get here? You know, I've earned the right to take a break from the work of the church. You know, I've done a lot. You know, I haven't been appreciated enough. And the last time I was in that role, and now it's time for some selfish entitlement. You know, these aren't the exact words we might be saying, but, you know, I'm not talking about someone who goes on vacation. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about someone who's on a maternity leave. I'm not talking about someone who needs a mental health day or some time to work on their marriage or be with their family. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when we, like King David, disengage spiritually. So Joab was sieging Rabbah, and a siege is this point in warfare where the attacker encounters this enemy fortified position that they cannot quickly, overcome or defeat. And so sieges, especially in ancient times, was typically very long, tiring, and tedious. Siege comes from the Latin word for sit, which is basically what would happen. The attackers would sit around the enemy city, hoping that you lose less men attacking and less resources than they do defending. And, the daily life of a siege is often brutal. It's not glamorous. It's not the glorious part of warfare. For someone like King David, I think this is probably the last thing that he wanted to do after a lifetime of fighting was to now sit around in enemy territory commanding a siege. I think David stayed home because he felt he was entitled to a little time off and didn't particularly want to do that battle. Someone else will finish the war he started. And then one evening, after a long day in bed, David decides, well, maybe I'll go up for a walk on my roof. The rest is history. A season of entitlement in David's life turned into a full-blown episode of narcissistic behavior. You can read the whole text, chapter 11 and 12. He used his power and authority to sleep with a married woman, the wife of a loyal friend, a friend who had been with him, fought with him, was loyal to him long before he was king, when he was still on the run. And then when he found out that this man's wife was pregnant, he decided to cover up his sin in various ways, and it wasn't working out the way he wanted, and so he decided the best thing I can do is kill this guy. So he had his old friend killed in the battle, in that siege that he should have been at in the first place. Church, I think we can sometimes recall maybe the glory days of our Christian walk. No matter how old you are, wherever you're at in life, we can recall reaching out to dozens and hundreds of people. We can recall that when God called me out of the darkness, and I had to fight through so much sin and all the life situations to get to where I am now, and all the Bible studies that I was a part of back then. But now this part of our journey, maybe to you it feels a little bit more like a siege than it does an exciting string of victories and successes. But does that make us feel like we've fought our battles and now we're ready to sit this one out and take it easy? Time to let someone else do the fighting. I've been there too, acting as a commentator, like we'll see in the Super Bowl, where that you point at the gaps that you see in the plan, the gaps in the church, the needs that are there. Like nobody thought of that. Nobody thought to do this. But not filling the gap myself, like I'm the one calling it out. But maybe that's not you. Maybe you're one of those super servants in the church, right? You come to church 1, 2, 3 hours early, you're setting up, you're putting the signs out in the cold, you're practicing the worship, you're counting the money in the back. You might have a schedule throughout the week that's busier than a CEO with all of the ministry appointments that you have lined up. Awesome. You're doing the work of the church. You're doing God's work. But I know that we must never let feelings of pride and entitlement creep in and take us out of the battle. Occasionally the feelings, they creep into my heart. And I know that it's when I'm taking my focus off who I am serving and I start to put that focus on myself. So my plea with you this morning is wherever you're at, keep your focus on God and the battle. Because we either focus on the battle or we focus on ourselves. If this was anyone's battle, that siege, it was David's. He went to war over the insult. But I want to ask you this morning, is there a battle in your life that God has called you to that you are not present for? In psychology, there's this thing called the bystander effect. And that's where when there's someone in urgent need of help, typically in a public place, and then the more people that are around to witness this person in need, the less likely each individual is to feel a draw to go and help that person because there's so many other people around. Do we feel, though, that as a part of God's church, that if we don't go to the fight that God has called us to, that someone else is going to go and fill in that gap? Someone else is going to go fill the need if it's not us. Someone else will answer the call for leadership, because that's not what I want to do right now. Someone else will be the mentor for the youth, for my kid. Someone else will volunteer. Someone else will serve. I want to ask, do we make life decisions, career decisions that take us further away from the battle? Have you taken on so much at work that you don't have time to volunteer or serve or be a member and part of the ministry that you're a part of? Do we spend more time battling enemies in our video games and watching the heroes fight the enemies in the movies than we do in the battle for souls? I've had good friends that I grew up with in my teen ministry with great spiritual intentions, more spiritual than me, and yet they choose simply to go to a school that was just too far to make it to the nearest campus ministry. And it's so hard to be a part of the battle when you're that far away from nourishment and encouragement in your fellow soldiers. Engaging in the battle is an active choice. David, he didn't leave the siege to go and commit adultery and a little bit of murder. No, he simply stayed home when everyone else went off to war. And so now I want to ask, how do we respond? How do we respond when we see that maybe we're not serving out the purpose that God has called us to? And before we look at what happened to David, I actually want to go back in time and look at the king before him. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but Saul is probably pretty close to being a narcissist. He meets the dictionary definition. He was consumed with selfishness, entitlement, pride. He was always concerned with his own honor, even over God's. And now in Saul's time, there was a prophet named Samuel. God sent Samuel to go and confront Saul because Saul had disobeyed God's direct orders about a battle that he had just went through. Samuel, he was looking for Saul, and he asked some people, they say, you can find him on the nearby mountain. He's building a monument to himself. And so Samuel goes to him. He says, why haven't you obeyed the Lord? Saul said to Samuel, but I have obeyed the Lord. Okay, well, but the army, they took some of the plunder, and some of the sheep and the cattle, and just the best, though. Just the best of what was slaughtered, we're going to offer it to your God in Gilgal. That's all. Saul's first response was to lie. His second response was to blame. And then the next was to make excuses. It reminds me of me when my parents would come in and ask if I did the chores. And I'm like, of course I did the chores. Well, okay, so actually I was, and then Amy was distracted me, and I was going to get to it. Well, okay, you asked me way too soon. It's only been 2 days. They'll get the trash next week, of course. This type of response, it's someone who is consumed with selfish pride and an elevated view of themselves. Saul was more concerned with his own honor and the optics of this event than honoring God. What God thought of him. He's trying to explain to a prophet that in fact he had honored God at the base of a monument to himself. But in what ways can we find ourselves in a similar situation? I asked, how should we respond? I believe that a humble person will thank those who bring the word of God to them and point out how they're not living it out. And I believe that prideful people will eventually come to hate them for it. There was a prophet in David's time named Nathan. Now, God sent him to go confront David about what we had just talked about earlier. And in 2 Samuel 12, starting in verse 1, when he came to David, Nathan said, let me tell you a little situation here. So there's these two men in a certain city. One's rich, the other one very poor. And, the rich man, he had a great many flocks and herds, right? Yeah, but the poor man, he had nothing. He had nothing. Except for this little lamb that he had acquired. And, he loved this thing. He raised it up, and it grew up alongside him and his children. It ate his food. It drank out of his cup. And it slept in his arms. He loved this thing. It was like a daughter to him. And then in verse 4, Nathan goes on to say that the rich man, he came and he stole this little lamb. He cooked it and he ate it with a friend that was from out of town. David became very angry at this man. He said, as surely as the Lord lives, this man deserves to die for this. At least pay 4 times over. Nathan said to David, you are that man. A few verses later, David exclaimed to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. David, he was humbled. No lies, no blaming, no excuses. He wasn't living out the purpose that God had for him. He had taken his focus off the battle for a short time. And it cost him, cost his family, and it cost his nation dearly. When we take our focus off the battle, we are susceptible to destructive thoughts and actions that creep in. If you're realizing this morning that you and your attention have been elsewhere, now is the time to respond like David. No lies, no blaming, no excuses, just humble and repentant, because God has a purpose for you. Battles that He has designed you specifically to fight, needs that He has made you to fill. And if you are one of those who have been serving God tirelessly, and there are many, don't let this become about how much respect and appreciation you get. I say this not because I think that the church has some major problem with this, but because I know how easily it is that these things slip into my heart. Our Savior wasn't respected or appreciated for what He did in His time. He was killed for it. Luke 17:10, Jesus says, so you too, when you have done everything you were commanded to do, should say, we are slaves undeserving of special praise. We have only done what was our duty. This was Jesus' attitude even with God. He was willing to submit to death on a cross. He set the ultimate example for us about how we are to serve our God. And sometimes we feel like we are King David. We have this endless string of victories and successes, but sometimes life just feels a little bit more like a siege. But we must stay focused on God and the battles that He puts before us. If we do, we will be protected from those narcissistic traits. We'll remain close to God, and we will be an inspiration for generations to come, church. Church, let's stay focused on our God and stay focused on the battles that He puts before us. We're going to have a prayer and then a final song. God, we thank You so much for calling us out of the darkness, God. I pray that we never forget it's You who've done the work in our lives. God, I pray that we have the humble attitude of Jesus as we serve in any capacity that You've called us to. God, I pray that we will respond humbly and repentant. No lies, excuses, or blaming, like You've shown us is what You want for our lives, God. God, I thank You for the opportunity to be a part of Your kingdom. I pray that we can share that with the whole world. We love You. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.